Richard Lane, a successful but emotionally distant man, becomes suspicious of a new cleaning lady, Sarah, and sets up a hidden camera. This simple act leads to a life-changing journey, uncovering secrets, confronting his past, and challenging his beliefs. Richard Lane sat in his corner office, high above the city streets, the weight of another long day settling on his shoulders. The view from his window, a panorama of glass and steel, had once filled him with a sense of pride, of accomplishment. Now, it was just another reminder of everything that had slipped through his fingers. 18 months had passed since Marianne died, but her absence was a constant presence, a shadow that followed him through every hour of every day. Work had become his refuge, a place where he could lose himself in the numbers, in the deals, in the ruthless precision that had made him the success he was. There was comfort in the routine, in the predictability of deadlines and contracts, in the sharp, clean lines of spreadsheets and reports. But even here, in the heart of his empire, the memories of his wife lingered, seeping into the spaces where he tried to hide from them. Richard had never been a man who let emotions rule him. He'd built his life on logic, on control, on keeping everything and everyone at a distance. It was how he'd survived, how he'd thrived. But since Marianne's death, something had shifted. He found himself distracted, haunted by the small, everyday things that used to be their life together. A book left open on a shelf, a half-empty bottle of her favorite perfume, a framed photograph on his desk. Each one was a reminder of the life he'd lost, and no amount of work could fill that void. It was around this time that he noticed the new cleaning lady. She was different from the others, though he couldn't say exactly why. Her name was Sarah, and she moved through the office with a quiet efficiency that should have gone unnoticed. Yet there was something about her presence that tugged at Richard's attention, something in the way she carried herself that made him uneasy. She was careful, meticulous, and somehow, too observant. It started with small things. The way she lingered just a moment longer in certain parts of the office, particularly near Marianne's old desk. The way her fingers brushed lightly over the framed photograph on the side table, as if she were trying to absorb some essence from it. He began to notice these moments more and more, and each time, it sent a ripple of discomfort through him. Richard wasn't a man prone to irrational fears, but his instincts had always served him well. And right now, those instincts were telling him that something wasn't quite right with Sarah. The wallet test was an idea that came to him one evening, as he watched her move through his office with that same calm, almost reverent demeanor. It was a simple plan: leave the wallet out in the open, in a place where she couldn't miss it, and see what she did. He didn't truly believe she would take it. Sarah didn't seem the type. But it wasn't about the money or the cards inside. It was about her reaction. Would she glance at it and move on, as any honest person would? Or would there be a flicker of hesitation, a sign that she was weighing her options? Richard wanted to see how she handled the unexpected, how she reacted when things weren't as they should be. So that night, before leaving, Richard carefully placed his wallet on the desk, just slightly askew, just enough to catch the eye. Then he walked to the corner of the room, where the large bookshelf stood, and selected a discreet spot among the books to place a hidden camera. It was a small, unobtrusive device, easily overlooked, but with a clear view of the desk and surrounding area. He adjusted the camera, making sure it would capture everything, then stepped back to assess his work. The office looked exactly as it should: orderly, controlled, with no sign of the trap he had just set. Satisfied, he turned off the lights, his mind already racing with what he might discover in the morning. The door clicked shut behind him as he left the office, the plan in motion, his suspicions waiting to be confirmed or dismissed. Richard Lane had always valued precision. He believed in order, in things being where they were meant to be. It was a way of maintaining control in a world that so often seemed determined to strip it from him. But now, as he sat in his office, watching the footage from the night before, a cold discomfort settled in his chest. Sarah moved through the room with her usual efficiency. She dusted, wiped down surfaces, and straightened papers with the same care she applied to every task. Yet there was something off, something that made Richard lean forward in his chair, eyes narrowing at the screen. She paused by the photograph on the side table, the one of Marianne, his late wife, smiling on their last vacation together. It was a small moment, barely a hesitation, but Richard caught it. Sarah's hand hovered just above the frame, her fingertips grazing the edge as though she were tracing the lines of Marianne's face. Her lips moved, but the camera's audio didn't pick up the words, if there were any. The unease he'd felt the first time he noticed Sarah in his office returned, stronger now. What was she doing? Why this interest in Marianne's photo? Richard rewound the footage, playing it back slowly, watching every detail. Sarah lingered over the photograph, her expression almost reverent. It wasn't just the photo, though. As he continued to watch, Richard saw her stop at Marianne's old writing desk, the one he couldn't bear to part with after she died. The desk was more of a relic now, unused and mostly untouched. But Sarah seemed drawn to it. She wiped it down as usual, but then her hands stilled. She pressed her palms flat against the wood, closed her eyes, and stood there, as if absorbing something from the desk itself. A chill ran down Richard's spine. This was no longer just a matter of curiosity, it was something deeper, something that brushed against the edges of his carefully guarded grief. He fast-forwarded through the rest of the footage, searching for more clues, more signs of what Sarah might be up to. She moved to the bookshelf next, where Marianne's favorite books were still lined up in their familiar order. Richard had never touched them, couldn't bring himself to disturb the arrangement she'd so lovingly maintained. Sarah's fingers ran along the spines, her touch delicate, almost tender. Again, she paused, as though contemplating something before finally stepping back and finishing her work. Richard's breath came a little faster now, his mind racing with questions. What did she want? Why was she so drawn to these things, these remnants of Marianne's life? His initial suspicions deepened, turning into something more, an obsession, perhaps, to uncover what lay behind Sarah's odd behavior. The following day, Richard made a decision. He left out more items, objects that had once belonged to Marianne. A locket she used to wear, a book of poetry she'd loved, even her favorite fountain pen. He placed them strategically around the office, each one a potential trigger for whatever it was that Sarah was responding to. That evening, he left the office later than usual, his pulse quickening as he locked the door behind him. He didn't know what he was expecting to find the next morning, but the anticipation gnawed at him, keeping him awake through the night. When he returned to his office the following day, everything appeared untouched. The wallet was still where he'd left it, and the personal items were in their places, undisturbed at first glance. But Richard knew better now. He quickly sat down at his desk, pulling up the camera feed, fast-forwarding to when Sarah entered the room. Once again, she moved with her typical calm, cleaning and straightening with practiced hands. But Richard's breath caught as she approached the locket. She picked it up, holding it in her palm, her thumb rubbing over the engraved surface. Her lips moved, and though the audio was still useless, he could see the intensity in her expression, the way her eyes softened as if she were speaking to someone. It was as though she was having a conversation with Marianne, one that he wasn't privy to. The pen came next. Sarah didn't just clean around it, she picked it up, examined it, then placed it back down with a kind of reverence that bordered on the unsettling. Each item she touched seemed to carry a weight for her, a significance that Richard couldn't understand but was determined to unravel. By the time she reached the book of poetry, Richard's hands were clenched into fists, his heart pounding in his chest. Sarah opened the book, flipping through the pages until she reached a specific one. She paused there, staring at the words, before slowly closing it and placing it back on the shelf. She lingered, her gaze distant, almost sorrowful, before she turned and left the room. Richard sat back, staring at the screen long after Sarah had gone. Something was happening here, something he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. This wasn't about the wallet anymore, or even about whether she was trustworthy. It was about Marianne, about the things she had left behind, and the strange connection that Sarah seemed to have with them. He had to know more. He had to find out what Sarah knew, what she was seeing or feeling that he wasn't. And for the first time in a long while, Richard Lane felt a fear that wasn't rooted in business or power, but in the unknown, in the possibility that his wife was trying to tell him something from beyond the grave. Richard waited until the office was empty. The day's business had been handled, the office staff long gone, leaving only silence. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the footage he'd just reviewed. Sarah's actions, her reverence, the way she lingered near Marianne's things, were too precise, too deliberate. There was something she wasn't telling him, something he needed to confront head-on. He called Sarah to his office. When she entered, her demeanor was calm, almost serene, as if she had been expecting this conversation. Richard studied her, trying to read the face of the woman who had unsettled him so profoundly over the past weeks. "Close the door," he said, his voice firmer than usual. She complied without hesitation. Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What's going on, Sarah? I've noticed your behavior. The way you handle certain things in this office. It's unusual." Sarah remained composed, her eyes steady on his. "I understand why you'd think that, Mr. Lane." "Do you?" His tone was sharp. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you're here for reasons other than your job." Sarah took a deep breath, and Richard saw a flicker of something, was it relief, cross her face. "You're right. I'm not just here to clean your office." Richard's pulse quickened. "Then why are you here?" There was a pause, a heartbeat of silence, before Sarah spoke again, her voice softer now, almost gentle. "I'm here because of your wife, Mr. Lane. I'm a psychic. I can communicate with spirits. Marianne has been trying to reach you through me." Richard stared at her, the words hanging in the air between them, impossible to grasp. A psychic? Communicating with spirits? It was absurd. And yet, the way Sarah spoke, with such calm certainty, left him off balance. "You expect me to believe that?" he said, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "I don't expect anything," Sarah replied. "I'm just telling you the truth. Marianne has been trying to send you messages for some time now, but the connection has been difficult. That's why I took this job, to get closer to you, to help her reach you." Richard shook his head, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "How did you even end up here? How did you know she was trying to reach me?" "I've encountered situations like this before," Sarah explained, her tone patient. "When messages are unclear, when the spirit is struggling to connect, I sometimes try to get closer to the family, to the places where they lived, to better understand what they're trying to say. I tried to contact you directly, but when that didn't work, I looked for another way. When I saw there was a position available here, I applied. It was the best way to be near you and the things that held meaning for Marianne." The logic behind her actions sent a chill down Richard's spine. "You're saying you planned this? That you've been, what? Watching me?" "No," Sarah said quickly. "Not watching. Just trying to help. Marianne's messages have been coming through stronger since I started working here, but they're still fragmented. She's concerned, Mr. Lane. There's something she desperately needs to tell you." Richard wanted to dismiss her, to call this all nonsense and send her on her way. But there was something in her eyes, in the quiet intensity of her voice, that made him pause. "And what exactly has she been telling you?" Sarah hesitated, and for the first time, Richard saw uncertainty in her expression. "It's mostly feelings, images, memories. She's worried about you. She's been showing me moments from your life together, things that only she would know. She mentioned a song, La Vie en Rose. She said it was your song, that she sang it to you on your wedding night. She showed me an image of you two dancing in a room with a red door. She wanted you to remember that night." Richard's breath caught in his throat. The song, the red door, those were details no one could know. The memory of their wedding night flooded back to him, a night so private, so intimate that it was impossible for anyone else to have known about it. And yet, here was Sarah, recounting it with an accuracy that shook him to his core. How do you know these things?" he demanded, his voice faltering. "Marianne showed them to me," Sarah said softly. "She's trying to reach you, to tell you that she's still here, still watching over you. But there's something more, something urgent that she needs you to understand." Richard felt the room tilt, the ground beneath his feet unsteady. He had spent months trying to lock away his grief, to compartmentalize the pain of losing Marianne. And now, in a single moment, all those barriers were crumbling. "Why should I believe any of this?" Richard asked, though the fight was draining from his voice. "You don't have to believe me," Sarah replied, her eyes meeting his with quiet strength. "But you know Marianne. You know she wouldn't rest if there was something important she needed to tell you. And she's chosen me to help you hear her." Richard looked at Sarah, the weight of her words settling on his chest. The skepticism he had clung to was unraveling, and in its place, a new, terrifying possibility was taking root. If Marianne was really trying to reach him, then ignoring it was no longer an option. But what could be so important, so urgent, that she would go to such lengths to communicate from beyond the grave? As he stood there, the world spinning around him, Richard Lane realized he had no choice but to find out. Richard stared at Sarah, the shock of her revelation still rippling through him like a jolt of electricity. He felt the ground shift beneath him, his carefully constructed world teetering on the edge of collapse. For a moment, the room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing in with the weight of the impossible truth she had just laid at his feet. But then, just as quickly, the disbelief surged back, a wave of anger and denial that forced him to his feet. "This is absurd," he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "You've overstepped, Sarah. I don't believe a word of it." Sarah didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes steady on his, as if she had expected this reaction. "I know it's hard to believe, Mr. Lane. But everything I've told you is the truth." "Get out," Richard ordered, his tone final. "You're fired. I don't want to see you in this house again." For a moment, Sarah hesitated, as if she wanted to say more, to plead her case. But then she simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said quietly. "But if you change your mind, you know how to reach me." Richard didn't respond. He watched her leave, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing through the empty house. He stood there for a long moment, his fists clenched at his sides, willing the anger to drown out the gnawing doubt that had taken root inside him. But as the hours ticked by, the anger began to ebb, leaving only the doubt behind. Richard tried to focus on his work, burying himself in contracts and figures, but his mind kept circling back to Sarah's words, to the image of her standing there in his office, speaking with such calm certainty about things she had no business knowing. By evening, the doubt had grown into something larger, something he could no longer ignore. He knew he should let it go, move on, dismiss her claims as nonsense. But something deep inside him, something he had been trying to silence for years, was telling him that she might be right. As night fell, Richard found himself staring at the phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. Finally, with a sigh of resignation, he dialed Sarah's number. She answered on the first ring. "Mr. Lane," she said, her voice devoid of surprise. "I was expecting your call." Richard's throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "Come back tomorrow. I want to hear more." The next day, Sarah arrived promptly, her demeanor as calm and composed as ever. Richard led her to the living room, where Marianne's presence still lingered in every corner, in every carefully chosen piece of furniture, in the photographs that lined the walls. It was a room he rarely entered anymore, too full of memories he wasn't ready to confront. But today, it felt like the right place to be. They sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Richard's gaze drifted to a photograph of Marianne on the mantel, her smile warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the turmoil he felt inside. "Tell me," Richard said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Tell me what she's been trying to say." Sarah closed her eyes, her breathing slowing as she reached out, connecting with the presence that only she could feel. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost reverent. "Marianne wants you to know that she forgave you, Richard. She knew about the affair. She knew about the child you had with that other woman." Richard's heart slammed against his chest. He stared at Sarah, his mind reeling. He had buried that part of his life so deep, convinced that no one, especially Marianne, had ever known. The affair had been a mistake, a moment of weakness during a rough patch in their marriage, something he had tried to forget the moment it ended. But the child. The son. He had known about him, of course, but he had never acknowledged him, never reached out, never accepted responsibility. And now, to hear that Marianne had known all along, that she had kept that knowledge to herself, forgiven him without ever breathing a word, was more than he could comprehend. "How could she have known?" he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I never told her. She never said anything." "She didn't want to burden you with it," Sarah said gently. "She loved you, Richard. She understood that you regretted what you had done, and she chose to forgive you because she believed in your love, in your commitment to her. But she also knew that one day you would need to face the truth." Richard felt a tear slip down his cheek, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a vice. "Why now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why is she telling me this now?" "Because the boy needs you," Sarah replied, her gaze unwavering. "He's sick, Richard. Seriously ill. His mother can't afford the treatment he needs, and Marianne can't rest knowing that you're out there, capable of helping, but unaware of the situation. She wants you to step up, to be the father you never were." Richard's world spun out of control. The guilt he had managed to push aside for so many years now flooded him, drowning him in its intensity. He had failed his son, failed Marianne, and now, in the worst possible way, he was being called to account. "I don't know if I can do this," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can," Sarah said, her voice firm but kind. "You have to. Marianne believes in you, and she's asking you to make this right. It's not too late, Richard. You can still help him. You can still be the father he needs." Richard's hands trembled as he buried his face in them, overwhelmed by the enormity of what was being asked of him. But deep down, he knew Sarah was right. He couldn't ignore this any longer. He couldn't keep running from his past. When he finally looked up, there was a new resolve in his eyes. "I'll find him," he said, his voice steadying. "I'll find my son and make things right." Sarah nodded, a small smile of approval on her lips. "Marianne knew you would." Richard had always been good with words. He knew how to turn a phrase, how to convince others to see things his way. But standing on Elise's doorstep, he realized that no amount of persuasion could undo the damage he had done. Her eyes were cold, her face set in a mask of controlled fury that spoke of years of hurt and betrayal. "What are you doing here, Richard?" Elise's voice was like ice, slicing through the quiet of the afternoon. Richard felt his throat tighten. He had rehearsed what he would say, but now, faced with the reality of the woman he had wronged so deeply, the words seemed hollow. "Elise, I know I'm the last person you want to see. But I need to talk to you about our son." The mention of their child made her stiffen, her eyes narrowing. "Our son?" she repeated, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "You don't have a son, Richard. You made that perfectly clear when you walked out on us. Remember?" Richard winced, the truth of her words cutting him deeper than he'd expected. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I was a coward, and I handled everything horribly. But I'm here now because I want to help." Elise crossed her arms over her chest, her expression hardening even further. "Help?" she spat. "You think you can just show up after all these years and fix everything with your money? You thought you could buy me off back then, and now you think you can buy your way out of the guilt? It doesn't work that way, Richard." He could see the pain in her eyes, the way it had festered over the years, turning into something sharp and bitter. "Elise, please. I've changed. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to do the right thing now. I've heard our son is sick, and I can't just stand by and do nothing." "How did you even know about that?" she snapped, suspicion flashing in her eyes. "Have you been spying on us?" "How dare you?" "No," Richard interrupted, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I haven't been spying. I swear. I didn't even know where you were until recently. I found out because of a psychic." Elise stared at him, her disbelief turning to anger. "A psychic? You really expect me to believe that?" Richard Lane, the man who doesn't believe in anything he can't control, is here because a psychic told him to be? "I know how it sounds," Richard said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. "But it's the truth. Sarah, she's the psychic, came to me with messages from Marianne." "Marianne?" Elise's voice trembled with fury. "Your wife? The one you stayed with while you abandoned me and your son?" "Yes," Richard replied, swallowing hard. "Marianne knew about our son, Elise. She knew everything, and she's been trying to tell me that I need to help him, to be there for him in a way I wasn't before." Elise's hands clenched into fists, her body trembling with rage. "So now you're trying to pin this on your dead wife? You think that makes it better? You think that's going to erase the years of struggle, of raising a child on my own, while you lived your perfect life?" Richard's heart sank. He had hurt her more deeply than he had ever realized, and nothing he could say now would make up for that. "Elise, I'm not trying to erase anything. I just want to help our son. Please, let me do that." Elise took a step forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "You don't get to do this, Richard. You don't get to waltz back into our lives and pretend to care. You made your choice a long time ago, and now you have to live with it. I don't want your help, and neither does my son. You need to leave. Now." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but the look in her eyes silenced him. There was no more room for negotiation, no more chances to make things right. He had pushed her too far, and now he was paying the price. Without another word, he turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing in his ears as he made his way back to his car. As he drove away, the weight of his past bore down on him, suffocating any hope he had of redemption. Elise sat by her son's bedside, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The hospital room was dimly lit, the hum of machines the only sound breaking the silence. Her son, James, had always been a fighter, but lately, the fight seemed to be slipping from him, the strength that had carried him through so much now waning in the face of an illness that refused to be beaten. She hadn't slept much in days, too afraid to close her eyes and miss something important. Every cough, every labored breath, felt like another step closer to the edge, and the fear that had gripped her for so long was now a constant, gnawing ache in her chest. She had done everything she could to protect James, to give him the best chance at life, but she was out of options, out of time. And then there was Richard. The thought of him brought a fresh wave of anger, mingled with a deep, painful resentment. He had left them, turned his back on their son before he was even born. How dare he think he could just reappear, as if nothing had happened? Yet, as much as she wanted to shut him out, there was another part of her, the part that was desperate to save her son, that couldn't ignore the possibility that Richard could help. Another cough racked James's small body, pulling Elise from her thoughts. She leaned over, brushing a hand across his forehead, her heart breaking as he stirred weakly. She couldn't do this alone anymore. She had to think of James, not her pride, not her pain. With a deep breath, Elise reached for her phone, her hand trembling as she dialed the number she had promised herself she wouldn't use. It rang once, twice, and then Richard's voice came through, tense and alert. "Elise," he said, his voice cutting through the static of the line. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "Richard, she hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "I need your help." "James, he needs your help." There was a brief silence, and she could almost hear the relief in his voice when he finally responded. "I'll be there as soon as I can." True to his word, Richard acted swiftly. Within hours, James was transferred to one of the best hospitals in the city, a facility known for its cutting-edge treatments and round-the-clock care. Richard was a whirlwind of efficiency, making arrangements, signing documents, and ensuring that every possible resource was available to his son. Elise watched him in a daze, the speed and precision with which he moved both astonishing and disorienting. When the doctors confirmed that James was settled and stable, Richard turned to Elise, his expression earnest. "I want to meet him," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "I need to see my son." Elise hesitated, the old anger flaring up, but it was tempered now by exhaustion and the undeniable fact that Richard had done everything he could to help. He had taken control, made things happen that she never could have on her own, and for that, she was grateful, no matter how much she wished she didn't have to be. After a long moment, she nodded. "Okay. But please, be gentle with him. He's been through so much." Richard nodded, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders as he followed Elise into the hospital room. The sight of James lying in the bed, pale and frail, hit Richard like a physical blow. He had known the boy was ill, but seeing him in person, so small and vulnerable, brought the reality crashing down on him with brutal force. Richard approached the bed slowly, his eyes taking in every detail, the dark circles under James's eyes, the thinness of his arms, the way his breath hitched with each inhale. He felt a surge of emotions, guilt, sorrow, determination, mixing into a fierce resolve. This was his son, his flesh and blood, and he would move heaven and earth to save him. James's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, the boy looked up at Richard with a mix of confusion and curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Richard's heart ached at the question, but he forced a smile. I'm your father, James," he said gently. "I'm here to help you get better." James blinked, processing the words. "My father?" he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Yes," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you before, but I'm here now. And I promise, I'll do everything I can to help you. James nodded weakly, the effort of speaking clearly tiring him out. He closed his eyes again, drifting back into the uneasy sleep that had become his constant companion. Richard remained by his side, his hand resting lightly on James's, feeling the fragility of the small fingers beneath his. Over the following days, Richard threw himself into caring for James with a single-minded determination. He coordinated with the doctors, stayed by his son's bedside through the long hours, and ensured that no expense was spared in securing the best possible care. He barely slept, his focus entirely on James, on giving him the chance he had denied the boy for so long. Elise watched him, still wary, still guarded, but slowly, her walls began to crack. She saw the genuine care in Richard's eyes, the regret that shadowed his every action, and the fierce love he was beginning to build for the son he had never known. It was impossible to ignore, even as she struggled to reconcile it with the man who had hurt her so deeply. One evening, as James slept peacefully for the first time in days, Elise found herself sitting next to Richard outside the hospital room. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, but there was a tentative truce in the air. "I can't keep him from you," Elise said finally, her voice soft but resolute. "He deserves to know his father. And I can see how much you care about him." Richard looked at her, surprised by the admission. "I never meant to hurt you, Elise," he said, his voice low. "I was a fool, and I'm sorry for everything I put you through. But I'm here now, and I want to be a father to James. I want to be the man he needs me to be." Elise nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Just don't break his heart, Richard. He's been through enough." Richard reached out, placing his hand over hers. "I won't," he promised. "I'll do whatever it takes to make up for the time I've lost. I'll be here, for both of you, for as long as you'll have me." As the days passed, James's health began to improve under the expert care of the medical team. Richard stayed by his side, reading to him, talking to him, slowly building a bond that had been so long denied. Each small victory, every smile, every moment of laughter, felt like a step closer to healing, not just for James, but for all of them. The weeks turned into months, and as time passed, Richard found himself spending more and more time with James. The boy was gaining strength, his cheeks filling out, his laughter returning in small bursts that lit up the room. Richard marveled at how resilient James was, how despite everything he had endured, there was still light in his eyes, still hope. For Richard, those moments were more than just small victories, they were the foundation of a relationship he had never imagined he would have. He read to James every night, told him stories about places they would visit once he was better, and, slowly but surely, they began to talk about their shared past. The conversations were tentative at first, filled with gaps and hesitations, but over time, the gaps began to close. Richard told James about the mistakes he had made, about the regret that had weighed on him for so long. He didn't shy away from the truth, didn't try to sugarcoat the pain of it, because he owed James that much honesty even when it hurt. James listened, sometimes quietly, sometimes with questions that caught Richard off guard with their insight and depth. And as Richard opened up, he found that the bond between them grew stronger, more natural. It was as if they were two pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their place, clicking together in a way that felt both inevitable and profound. The day Richard decided to publicly acknowledge James as his son was one of the most difficult and liberating of his life. He had spent years building a reputation as a man of power, of control, but this, admitting to the world that he had a child he had never claimed, was an act of vulnerability he wasn't sure he was capable of. But when he looked at James, saw the boy's tentative smile and the way he was slowly coming back to life, there was no doubt in his mind. It was time. Richard made the announcement in the same way he had handled every other major decision in his life, with purpose and determination. But this time, it wasn't just about business or reputation, it was about setting things right, about giving James the recognition and the future he deserved. And when the news broke, when the world learned that Richard Lane had a son he was finally acknowledging, the weight that had pressed down on him for so long began to lift. For Elise, the public acknowledgement brought a peace she hadn't known in years. She had spent so long carrying the burden of their secret, so many nights wondering if she had made the right decision by staying silent, by protecting James from the man who had once hurt her so deeply. But now, seeing Richard step up, seeing the love he was building with their son, she felt something shift inside her. The anger, the resentment, it wasn't gone, not completely, but it was softened by the realization that people could change, that Richard had changed. And in that change, there was hope for a different future, one where they could work together for the sake of the child they both loved. It was on one of those quiet evenings, when James was finally sleeping peacefully and the hospital room was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, that Sarah visited again. Richard hadn't seen her in weeks, but when she arrived, it was as if no time had passed at all. She entered the room with her usual calm presence, her eyes warm as she looked at Richard and Elise sitting together. "Sarah," Richard greeted her, his voice tinged with both gratitude and curiosity. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." Sarah smiled gently. "I have one last message for you, Richard," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made him sit up a little straighter. "Mary Ann wants you to know that she's at peace now. She's seen the way you've stepped up, the way you've cared for James and made him a part of your life. She's grateful to you for that. She's grateful that you've become the man she always believed you could be." Richard felt his throat tighten, the emotion catching him off guard. "She's at peace?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded. "Yes. She's happy for you, Richard. She knows you're in good hands now, with James and Elise. She won't need to communicate anymore, because she trusts that you'll continue to do right by them. It's time for you to move forward, to live your life with your new family." Richard swallowed hard, the tears he had held back for so long finally welling up in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing her messages to me. I don't know how to ever repay you for what you've done." Sarah's smile widened, and there was a twinkle in her eye that hinted at a deeper understanding. "There's no need for repayment, Richard. I was simply the messenger. What you've done with those messages, that's all you." As she turned to leave, Richard felt a sudden urge to ask her to stay, to tell him more about what she saw, what she knew. But he held back, realizing that Sarah's role in his life had come to its natural conclusion. She had helped him find his way, helped him rebuild the broken parts of his life, and now it was up to him to carry on. Sarah paused at the door, looking back at Richard and Elise one last time. "Take care of each other," she said softly. "And if you ever need me, well, you know where to find me." And with that, she was gone, leaving behind an air of mystery that seemed to fit her perfectly. Richard sat back, his gaze drifting to the sleeping figure of his son. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, there would be challenges, moments of doubt, and the inevitable scars of the past. But for the first time in a long time, Richard felt a sense of peace, of purpose, that had eluded him for so long. As he and Elise settled into their new roles, co-parents, partners in this new chapter of their lives, Richard knew that Mary Ann would always be a part of them, guiding them in ways both seen and unseen. Her love, her forgiveness, had paved the way for a future he hadn't thought possible, and he would carry that with him always. But there was also the future to think about, a future where James would grow stronger, where he would know the love of both his parents, where they could be a family, not in the way Richard had once envisioned, but in a way that was real, and true, and filled with the promise of new beginnings. And somewhere out there, Richard knew, Sarah was continuing her work, helping others find their way, just as she had helped him. Maybe, just maybe, their paths would cross again. But until then, he had a life to live, a son to raise, and a heart that was finally, truly open to the possibilities of what could be.